Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alan Barber, the Policy Director for the Progressive Caucus Action Fund. I want to thank you for joining us today, as well as the Worker Power Coalition and Indivisible for today's briefing. Now, this is an exciting time for the American labor movement. From Striketober to recent union drives at Amazon warehouses and Starbucks coffee houses, there's real momentum building for a fundamental reorganization of power in the workplace that amplifies worker voices and collective bargaining for better working conditions. With more workers seeking to organize their workplaces, and as we'll see today, the National Labor Relations Board, or NLRB, is essential to supporting workers seeking to exercise their right to bargain collectively. However, Congress has not provided additional funding for the NLRB to carry out its responsibilities to support workers seeking to unionize in nearly a decade. Congress now has the opportunity to increase funding for the NLRB to ensure that workers' rights to a union exist not only in theory, but in practice. During today's briefing, you'll hear from panelists on how the NLRB functions, how they support workers seeking to unionize, and why additional funding for the NLRB is critical. We hope that you walk away from this with a greater understanding of what the NLRB does, how it impacts your work, and ways in which you can incorporate support for the NLRB into your program. Be sure to stick around to the end for a Q&A session with the panelists. And once again, thank you for joining today for this important briefing. With that, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Today, we'll be joined by Celine McNicholas of EPI, Senator Bob Casey of Pennsylvania, and Joshua Springer of SEIU Local 49. First up, we'll hear from Celine. Celine McNicholas is the Director of Policy and Government Affairs at the Economic Policy Institute and has served as EPI's Labor Counsel and Director of Government Affairs. Celine, I'll turn things over to you.
Great. Thank you, Alan. For those who may not be familiar with the Economic Policy Institute, EPI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank that was created in 1986 to include the needs of low and middle wage workers in economic policy discussions. So decades of research by economists at EPI have found that unions reduce economic inequality. And I thought it would be helpful to start with a review of a bit about the economy and how unions impact our overall economic justice. I think it will help make clear how critical the NLRB is at this moment, because working people's right to a union and collective bargaining is critical if we're going to create an equitable post-pandemic economy. And the NLRB is the sole agency tasked with enforcing and protecting these rights. So as you can see in the first slide, inequality in our economy has grown exponentially over the last 5 decades. Wage growth has been uneven and it's failed to keep pace with productivity. Consider that before the pandemic, 140 million Americans were poor or near poor. That means living just one emergency above the poverty line. It's estimated that the 140 million grew to 150 million during the pandemic. The US economy in 2019 had the highest inequality ever in US history, according to the US Census Bureau. And while inequality has grown, the share of workers in a union has dropped significantly. In fact, the rate of unionization in the US is lower than it was before workers had a federally protected right to join unions. This decline has nothing to do with fewer workers wanting a union. In fact, as you can see, nearly half of all workers say they would vote for a union in their workplace if given the opportunity. So what's the disconnect? The National Labor Relations Act, the NLRA, gave most private sector workers in the US the right to organize and bargain collectively. However, in the 80 years since the law was enacted, those rights have become increasingly inaccessible to the overwhelming majority of US workers. Consider that the NLRA has not been significantly amended since anti-union amendments passed in 1947. Structural weaknesses in the law, aided by an anti-worker federal bench, have allowed employers to interfere in and defeat efforts by workers to organize and to face no real consequences for doing so. This has resulted in a system of labor law that is truly rigged against workers. So clearly reform is needed. And I know most people joining the call are familiar with the Protecting the Right to Organize, or PRO Act, which would help restore the NLRA's power and make it easier for workers to join a union. Under the PRO Act, more workers would have the right to a union. Workers would have greater control over the process of selecting union representation, and employers would face penalties for violating workers' rights. While the PRO Act passed the House in a rare bipartisan vote this congressional session, it remains stalled in the Senate. So in spite of these deficiencies in the law, the NLRB does have a great deal of power in the enforcement of the NLRA, and it has a great deal of power to help workers win unions. The current board, highlighted by efforts of the General Counsel, is working with the tools it has to try and ensure that workers have a meaningful right to a union and collective bargaining. Again, I'll keep saying this, the NLRB is the only agency with the authority to enforce workers' right to a union and collective bargaining. There's no private right of action under the NLRA, so workers are dependent on the NLRB and its lawyers to take their case. I'll talk a little bit about the structure of the NLRB now, and you can see on the slide the way the board is divided. Essentially, the NLRB is divided into two main bodies: the board, which consists of 5 members who act as a quasi-judicial body and decide cases, and the General Counsel, who is independent from the board and is responsible for investigating and prosecuting violations of the NLRA. The board members and the General Counsel are nominated by the president and require Senate confirmation. The board members serve 5-year terms, and the General Counsel serves for 4 years. So in addition to deciding cases, the 5-member board also engages in regulatory efforts. That means the board issues rules that should help administer the NLRA. The board also has authority to conduct union elections and certify the results. Currently, the board consists of a majority of Democratic members. As I mentioned, the General Counsel operates independently of the board and functions as the prosecutor, essentially a district attorney for labor law violations. The General Counsel oversees the field offices, which is where the vast majority of the agency's work is done. Again, as you can see here, the General Counsel is responsible for supervising and managing most of the agency's lawyers who work to investigate and prosecute violations of the NLRA. The Office of the General Counsel ultimately decides which cases to bring and what kind of remedies to seek. So dependent on the view of the General Counsel, the NLRA can be narrowly interpreted to deny workers' rights or broadly interpreted to serve working people. And Jennifer Abruzzo is currently serving as General Counsel, and she was appointed by President Biden and has been working to ensure that the agency vigorously enforces the right to organize and bargain collectively, and has made a great deal of effort to undo many of the damaging views that the prior administration's General Counsel took that really denied workers the right to a union. The NLRB has no ability to investigate a matter unless a worker, an employer, or a union files a charge with the agency. So this makes it unlike the Department of Labor or other agencies with that investigatory power. The NLRB can only respond to matters when a party comes to the agency with the issue. So for workers, they come to the agency, like I mentioned, to file charges when an employer has violated their rights. And they may also file a petition for a union election. And as Alan mentioned, we're hearing a ton about organizing and the filing of election petitions before the board. Workers will file the charges or petitions in the field offices. So the field staff will help process election petitions and conduct those elections. Like the Amazon warehouse and Starbucks stores organizing, that's all of the petitions are filed out in the field, and those elections are conducted by field staff. So much of the agency's work takes place in the field. So I'm not going to go through all of the steps of all of these board processes, but I'll just quickly review that, as you can see here, when an election petition is filed, the board will ensure that there is sufficient support for the union, which is obviously indicated by having 30% of the bargaining unit sign a union authorization card. And then it will schedule and conduct an election and ultimately certify the results. So we know that employers often engage in anti-union campaigns when workers try and form a union. And as the next slide here shows, my colleagues at EPI and I analyzed board charges a few years ago and found that employers were charged with violating the law in 41.5% of all NLRB union elections. Even worse, employers were charged with illegally firing workers in 29.3% of all elections, and in nearly a third, 29.2%, of all elections, employers were charged with illegally coercing or threatening or retaliating against workers for supporting a union. So the NLRB is responsible for investigating all of these charges, and when it finds evidence of a violation, it takes the case for workers. So in spite of the growth in the workforce and the intensity of employer opposition to unions, as Alan mentioned, the NLRB's funding has remained essentially flat. The agency has received level funding of $274.2 million for the last 9 years with no adjustment for inflation. That may sound like a lot, but if you look at other allocations for agencies, you will see that it is a paltry investment in a really critical agency. Essentially, the flat funding represents a budget decrease of 25% in real dollars since FY 2010. And as you'll see in the next slide, underfunding has contributed to a decline in staffing. The number of full-time employees at the NLRB has dropped by nearly 39% since fiscal year 2002, so 39% in 20 years. Most troubling, staffing in the field offices, where again, most workers interact with the agency, has shrunk by 50% over that same time. Further, the NLRB has closed and consolidated field offices. It currently has 48 field offices. And that number may fail to show the impact of the agency's shrinking footprint. Consider that the Atlanta Regional Office covers a geographic area that stretches across 7 states, meaning that workers may have to drive hundreds of miles to be interviewed by a board agent investigating their case. So while some members of Congress have opposed efforts for additional funding of the agency, arguing that unions are declining and the agency's relevance is as well, consider that during the first half of fiscal year 2022, union election petitions filed at the NLRB have increased 57%, up to 1,174 from 748 during the first half of FY 21. The NLRB has also seen a 14% increase in charges of violations of the NLRA. There have been over 8,000 charges filed so far this year. Workers depend on the NLRB when employers unlawfully interfere with their right to form a union, and without adequate resources, the NLRB cannot do its job, and US workers and our economy suffer. As Alan mentioned, again, momentum around organizing is growing, and I know you're going to hear from someone on the front line of organizing shortly, and I'm sure that he will talk about how important it is to have a well-funded NLRB in his organizing efforts. From an economic policy perspective, I can say if we fail workers now and unions continue to decline, we will have an economy marked by inequality. Workers want unions because labor unions win workers higher wages, better benefits, and safer working conditions. I'll just quickly remind everyone here of the many benefits of unions for workers. A worker covered by a union contract earns 10.2% more than a peer in a non-unionized workplace. Unions help reduce gender and racial wage gaps. You can see that in the wages that are listed in the slide. In particular, Black workers represented by a union are paid 13.1% more than their non-unionized peers. Hispanic workers represented by a union are paid 18.8% more than their non-unionized peers. So this is really an issue of racial justice as well. 95% of workers covered by a union contract have access to employer-sponsored health benefits, and union employers contribute more to those health benefits. 93% of union workers have access to paid sick days. Union employers are more likely to offer retirement plans and to contribute more towards those plans than non-union employers. So I hope I'm making the case, probably preaching largely to the choir here, that unions have powerful effects on workers' lives in the workplace, but that's also true outside of work. In a recent report that colleagues of mine at EPI and I worked on, we found that in states that have higher rates of unionization, there are higher minimum wages, higher median annual incomes, and higher than average UI recipiency rates, meaning that more unemployed people receive benefits. And this was a huge issue, obviously, during the pandemic. States with higher unionization rates have lower percentages of uninsured populations and have elected universally to expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. So residents are further protected from losing healthcare coverage. States with higher unionization rates have significantly fewer restrictive voting laws, which means it's easier for all people in those states to vote. Unions have long helped workers win better lives for their families. Without adequate funding, the NLRB cannot safeguard U.S. workers' right to a union and collective bargaining. While we all fight for labor law reform, the board is an agency that can do something and is trying to do something right now. So it's really a critical moment. The policy decisions and investments that are made now are going to have long-standing impacts on our economy. And we know, certainly we at EPI know that unions are essential to a fair and equitable economy. We have to work to ensure that the agency that helps workers win a union has the resources it needs. It does not have that now. And I'll stop there, but I'm happy to answer any questions about the board or the processes under the NLRA that anybody has. So thanks, Alan.
And thank you, Celine. And just a quick reminder for folks, if you have a question for Celine or any of the other panelists, you can just drop that into the Q&A box and we'll be able to get to those after we hear from everyone. So joining us next, we have, as Celine mentioned, somebody who's on the front lines of this fight. Our next speaker is Joshua Springer. He's the Assistant Director of Healthcare Organizing for SEIU, local number 49 in Oregon. And he's here to speak to us today about his experience with the NLRB. Josh, I'll turn things over to you.
All right. Well, it's great to be here. I'd like to thank the PCAF for having me speak today. And I just share my experiences, as it's been mentioned, on the front lines of organizing in healthcare here in Oregon and Southwest Washington. Again, my name is Josh, and I'm one of the Assistant Directors of Healthcare Organizing at Local 49. We represent hospital workers in Oregon, Southwest Washington. And I've had about 9 years experience altogether organizing in healthcare, mostly private nonprofit sector and clinic-based systems. In that time, I've been a part of a number of campaigns and filed for NLRB elections, again, at dozens of different work sites across Oregon, Washington, and Colorado. So earlier this year, the story I'm going to share with you all today is that at Providence Medford Medical Center, a hospital located in Southern Oregon, techs and therapists filed to organize their union. They had a large group of passionate worksite leaders that were building networks of support, communication across the hospital departments, including the operating room, diagnostic imaging, respiratory therapy, cardiology. These techs and therapists had struggled for years now with dangerously low staffing levels, not enough safety equipment during the pandemic, as well as annual raises as low as 10 cents a year for years on end. A senior respiratory therapist who had worked there for over 20 years described conditions as bad as they'd ever been and only getting worse. So back on January 20th in 2022 of this year, Medford techs filed for their union with the NLRB, at that time with over 75% support. We as a local supporting their efforts, were preparing for the quickest election possible at a timeline that would help these workers win their union. We tried to avoid delays from management by accepting a bargaining unit that eventually lowered their support a little bit, but they still held over 70% support going into that election. Our experience has shown us too that most successful elections with the board are held in person at the worksite, in this case at the hospital. In this case, however, we had to accept a mail-in election process because of current NLRB practices and capacity. Ballots at that time were scheduled to be mailed out in late February 24th, and returned no later than March 24th, with a vote count to be held on March 28th. That's over 2 months since the Medford techs had filed for their union. It also didn't help that Medford, Oregon is a rural community about 5 hours or so away from Portland, where the NLRB offices are located, which caused the election to also be pushed back an additional week. So by the vote count, they unfortunately lost their union, these techs and therapists. Primarily, it was the extended timeline that allowed for management to erode support commit a litany of unfair labor practices, and raise tensions for workers to just unsustainable levels. In our experience, again, supporting hospital workers organized, one of the biggest factors is how much time an employer has to bust their union. Providence, in particular, the largest healthcare system here in Oregon, has a reputation for spending gobs of money on anti-worker consultants, whose job it becomes just to dramatically raise tension in the workplace, making people feel threatened, intimidated, harassed every single day they go into work. For example, management attacked workers at Providence Medford, organizing efforts really daily, pulling them into one-on-ones, breaking up conversations, and holding, again, daily anti-union meetings. One X-ray tech was pulled into dozens of one-on-one meetings with both their supervisor, their department director, and the CEO of the hospital, only because they continued to talk about with their coworkers across departments how they can improve the hospital for patients and for staff. The techs held their support for as long as they could, but eventually lost momentum with just this onslaught of pushback from management, and their support dipped below majority as they went into their vote count. So while the NLRB staff, regional staff, were professional and courteous when communicating with both workers and Local 49, we again found that the biggest barrier for Medford techs that they were not able to overcome when they filed was this prolonged timeline, which again afforded management with ample opportunity to bust their union organizing efforts. We know too, and my experience as well has shown that in working directly with the NLRB and filing for, again, dozens of elections, is they play an essential role when workers are ready to form their union. It is indeed an exciting time in the labor movement. And over the past 10 years, I've also seen just tens of thousands of hospital workers, file and win their elections and form their union. That said, when workers are ready to take that courageous step to stand together publicly, every single day matters between then when they file and when they win their union on that vote count day. Every single day is critical. And they deserve, these hospital workers, assurance that they can count on a fair process that doesn't give employers an unnecessary amount of time to crush their efforts. And really, again, now more than ever, after the past 2.5 years of being on the front lines of a global pandemic, these healthcare workers ought to have an attainable chance to join together for both better jobs, but also for improved patient care for their communities.
And Josh, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it looks like Senator Bob Casey has joined us. So we're going to cut to the senator really quickly. Senator Bob Casey of Pennsylvania has been a strong champion of workers' rights, including leading the effort for adequate funding for the NLRB in the Senate. He sits on the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, the Committee on Finance, the Select Committee on Intelligence, and is chair of the Special Committee on Aging. Senator, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Hey, thanks very much, and thanks for letting me jump ahead because of our Health, Education, Labor, Pensions Committee markup, which is one of those things you can't predict the timing of. So you're doing me a big favor by letting me in early. But just a couple of points. Number one is I want to thank the Congressional Progressive Action Fund for this opportunity, and I want to emphasize to you how much I appreciate the work that you all do on a range of issues. But for purposes of today, especially the work that you do to help working men and women all across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and all across our country. And the National Labor Relations Board is a critical part of that effort. And I know how hard you fight to help support the National Labor Relations Board. We all know that that board provides the opportunity for both fair labor practices as well as workplace democracy. And because we have a Democratic president, a Democratic vice president, and a Democratic Senate, as well as a House, but in the case of confirmations, it's the Senate that does that work. We have now a Democratic pro-worker majority on the NLRB and a pro-worker General Counsel. We know that that's critical because we have to recognize the ongoing effort by corporate America, not just most recently over a long period of time, but especially in the last few years, to kneecap unions. That's not a technical term. That's my my summation or estimation of what they're doing. Kneecapping unions in so many different ways. And in essence, over time, by both going after unions, undermining progressive causes, and rigging the tax code, all of that results in workers being undermined. And that includes the efforts undertaken over many years to stack the deck against workers by stacking the deck against them on the NLRB. I sent a letter with Senator Hickenlooper last month to the Appropriations Committee, urging them to give the board the funding it needs to do its job. We know that the board has been both understaffed and underfunded for a long period of time. I won't go through all the budget numbers, but that's critically important that they have the resources. That's one of the ways Republicans in Washington undermine the workings of the federal government. They just cut off the money or limit the money. And in this case, that's just another example. We also need to pass the Protect the Right to Organize Act. I've learned not to call it the PRO Act because a lot of people don't know what PRO means. You have to say Protect the Right to Organize Act. And we've got I think we're gonna have a vote on that upcoming in the next couple of weeks, we hope, in the Senate to get a vote on the PRO Act. I don't have to tell any of you how difficult it's been for workers across the country, but made worse when you have a tax bill as the Republicans rammed through. By the way, they did it with 51 votes in 2017, a tax bill, which was the biggest giveaway to corporations and rich people in recent American history. So one of the things that happened in that bill that got very little, almost no publicity, was they ripped away in the course of passing that bill the deduction for union dues. And workers who have a union dues deduction, or workers who have a deduction for expenses, got that ripped away from them. That was an intentional act by the Republican majority and the Republican administration. And we know that provision has to be restored. So I have a bill to do that. The second bill that I've introduced of late is a bill to finally deal with an egregious, really obscene part of our tax law, where corporations can engage in anti-union activity, both unlawful anti-union activity that violates the National Labor Relations Act, but even lawful activity that is then rewarded, whether it's illegal or legal activity busting unions, it's rewarded by a tax deduction, a tax break for that same activity, as if they're not doing something that's overtly political. So I have legislation to change that, and I would hope that we would get not only Democrats to support that, as we already have, but that we get at least some Republicans. So it's the No Tax Breaks for Union Busting Act. And what we're saying in that legislation is corporations shouldn't be interfering with workers' rights to organize, or generally. That should be prohibited, and that's why you need to have tough enforcement of the National Labor Relations Act. But even in the instance where the activity is in fact legal activity, they should not be rewarded by getting a tax write-off for that anti-union campaign, really treating it as a business expense instead of political speech, which it really is. So they're among the things we're working on, but no matter what we're doing in terms of legislation, the power to do this, the opportunity to move legislation, the opportunity to win some of these battles comes from organizations like yours. Your ability to reach the grassroots, to reach not just people in Washington, but to reach real people across the country who are making the case for unions, making the case to protect workers, and making the case for a more just and fair economy for everyone. So I appreciate the work you've done to help us do that, and I'm grateful for today's opportunity. Thanks very much.
And thank you, Senator Casey, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us this afternoon. That was very informative, and we appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And now we'll go back to Josh Springer, for the Assistant Director of Healthcare Organizing for SEIU Local 49. Josh, can you pick up where you left off, or was that a good point for you?
That was a pretty good point for me, actually, to kind of come to a close there. I think, again, though, I would just like to, thank the senator again for joining us today. And yeah, I really appreciate, all of his and our, congressional Democrats' work to pass the PRO Act. It would make a huge difference for us on the front lines in supporting workers organize. Yeah, especially if we can get an effective and well-funded NLRB that's there and ready, right, to facilitate timely and again, effective union elections across the country. We'd see a lot more hospital workers organized today. Again, like Celine was mentioning, right, the number of workers who support, forming a union is really high right now. And so it's an incredible opportunity we have, and we can't miss it.
Well, thank you, Josh, for sharing that very important perspective and giving us a sense of what it's like to be on the front lines of these very important and crucial fights. So now I think we're going to move to a question and answer session. We already have a few questions queued up, but if you have a question you'd like us to address, please type that into the Q&A box, and we will definitely do our best to get to it. And I think, Josh, you just alluded to some of the points that folks were bringing up in the Q&A box. The first question that we'll address is, what are the current penalties for employers that commit unfair labor practices? And we'll just toss that up to either one of you. You want to jump in there?
Josh, do you want to take it, or?
Go for it. I can add on to whatever you
can
have.
add, yeah. So I can say that the penalties are paltry under the NLRA. There are no civil monetary penalties. So unlike most worker protection statutes, it's really all about the monetary penalty is back pay for a worker who has been fired illegally. Outside of that, you're really looking at a limited set of penalties that are sort of embarrassing to even talk about, including posting a notice that an employer will refrain from engaging in an unlawful conduct, intimidating, coercing, threatening in the future. And when I say a poster, I'm talking about like the 8.5 by 11 posting to say that you're going to stop doing something that you've already done. It certainly doesn't right the wrong. I will say that this, the current general counsel has hinted that she is going to be looking at make whole remedies, so that which is in line with other employment statutes. So if there are emotional damages that a worker has experienced because he or she has been fired unlawfully for trying to organize, if you have missed credit card payments and interest has accrued on that account, she is going to look at ways of coming to employers who have discriminated against workers for their union activity and try and make those workers more whole. But obviously statutory changes would make that much easier.
Yeah, I think the only piece I would add to that, again, just to reiterate a bit too, is they are too small and far too late and after the fact, right? At the point in time penalties are applied, it's after workers have already lost their union and lost the opportunity to organize for years to come, right? And as the senator pointed out as well, right, with corporations having more money than they've ever had since recent tax breaks, right? They've got plenty of money to spend, right? Either violating workers' rights, committing ULPs. It's the cost of doing business when it comes to busting the union for these companies right now and organizations. And in many cases, in the organizing work that we do in nonprofit organizations that get tax breaks as well. So yeah, there's a litany of problems with the current enforcement that we have right now. By far and large, though, it's just too little, too late.
Thanks, Josh and Celine. And a quick follow-up to that. I know, Josh, you said that often those awards come too late. Once the judgment has been ruled, is there a timeline? Is there a timeline in which the employers are required to pay those back wages?
I'm not entirely sure. I know that there are individual cases oftentimes where an employee gets back pay. At that point, it's a very long timeline. The cases that I can think of, it's taken over a year for an employee who's been fired unjustly, has to go through the process of filing with the board. And oftentimes the employer will fight to the bitter end, right? And it will go all the way to mediation or through mediation. And even then, it's a bit of a toss-up of whether that individual employee, or in some cases, group of employees, is going to win that case. But we're talking in some cases, year plus long process for that individual.
Alan, can I make a plug here too? That the agency has compliance officers that when a judgment is issued in favor of a worker getting back pay, those compliance officers end up helping the workers actually get paid. As Josh mentioned, sometimes it can be years and years, unfortunately, that go by. Workers have moved, relocated, they need to be tracked down in order to receive their back pay award. And when the full-time employees at the agency dip to a certain level, the compliance is affected as well. And frankly, employers get away with not having to come into compliance when they do get a judgment against them.
Thanks for that, Celine and Josh. The next question, could either of you speak to the appropriations process and how outside organizations can plug in support for the NLRB?
I can try and take a little bit of this, and Josh, feel free to jump in. What I would say is that there's been the committee in the House, the Appropriations Committee has announced markups of FY23 proposals later this month. I believe, Alan can correct me if I'm wrong, I can correct myself later, that I think it's the end of June 23rd is the markup that will be the bill that includes the funding for the NLRB. Every organization can weigh in with members of that subcommittee and make it clear that funding worker protection agencies, in particular the National Labor Relations Board, is critical, and to honor the agency's request for a budget of over $300 million, a significant increase.
Great, that's super helpful. Let's go to the next question, which is coming from Daniel Keene, and Daniel's question is: the NLRB General Counsel has recently talked about potentially banning captive audience meetings and/or bringing back Joy Silk. Could the panelists describe the potential impact of these decisions? And might be helpful for some folks to talk a little bit more about what the Joy Silk doctrine is.
I can jump in here. I think the General Counsel's, interest in pursuing this is admirable and would actually make a difference, right? I think, requiring workers to attend an anti-union meeting on the job is not right. It does happen, and it's happened in every single organizing drive that I've been a part of. And they do it because it's effective, right? It's effective in stifling organizing efforts, right? It's the playbook that continues to work. I would add, though, as I think, as this would signal like an important change that needs to be made, from the board, I would also, though, add, though, right, that even if we stopped employers from doing captive audience meetings, not requiring people to be there, they would still hold non-required anti-union meetings, if not on a weekly, but a daily basis, right? That would also hurt workers' effort to organize. So while I feel like this is a necessary change, right, I would just highlight, though, that it won't stop most employers from continuing to hold anti-worker meetings. They just won't be required, and they will find ways to get around it as well. And we've seen that same tactic also, pursued in almost every campaign I've been a part of. So.
Thanks, Josh. Celine, did you have anything to add, or should we move on to the next?
No, I'm happy to talk a little bit about Joy Silk if that's helpful. People have forgotten all about it, but I think what the General Counsel's office, I am guessing, is trying to do here, obviously, is to, as Josh talked about in his organizing, help workers get to the bargaining table without a rigged election system, and that's essentially what Joy Silk would allow. Being able to order that under certain circumstances, employers end up being forced to recognize the union and bargain with workers absent an election. So I think thinking about how to do that, I mean, that was the way, it used to be under certain circumstances. And so I think she's probably just thinking about how can you unrig an election system and get workers and employers to the bargaining table where there's a legitimate, demand for recognition by a union.
Thanks. Our next question is coming from Andrew O'Neill, and Andrew asks, can you talk a bit about the actual voting and tallying mechanics of an NLRB election and the type of staff capacity that requires from the NLRB?
Okay, yeah, I can jump in on this one. So when it comes to the actual mechanics of an NLRB vote, they're pretty straightforward, and fairly simple. In most cases, right, though I will add, all of the components of a NLRB election are negotiated between both the union that is filing for the election with those workers and also the employer, right? So in the current system right now too, what we find ourselves doing as a union that wants to support successful NLRB elections, right, is we have to compromise with employers through these negotiations, right, to get, again, the quickest election possible, which we find is one of the largest factors, right, when we're trying to support workers win. What that's meant in successful elections, kind of like I was alluding to in our most recent experiences, instead of, as much as we love our vote by mail system out here in Oregon, and we've done it for a long time when it comes to our national and local elections, we find, right, that when workers have the opportunity to vote in their union at their worksite in person, those are the most successful elections. They also require more staff, right? They require more on-site NLRB staff to be there, right, during voting times for observation to make sure the law isn't being violated to run the election, right? But those are the successful voting processes that we've experienced in our efforts, our in-person elections. And yeah, as far as other mechanics, right? Once the list is determined, right, a worker just has to, show up with their ID and present that they're indeed on the list to vote. Either yes for representation or no. It's as simple as that, a box yes or a box no.
Great, thanks. That was really informative. Celine, did you have anything to add to that, or shall we move on? All right, we'll move right along. The next question is, as we move toward more and more remote work and decentralized workplaces, and this kind of gets to part of what you were talking about a second ago, Josh, how are current unions affected, or are they? How is the formation of a union affected?
Well, I would say in our experience organizing in hospitals and healthcare settings where work largely has not become remote, it has stayed intact as far as being at work sites for the most part, right? That's not true for every job and every role in healthcare systems, but for the majority of folks who are filing for their union, right, currently in hospitals that are dealing with unsafe working conditions and unfair working conditions, those folks are still going to work every day. How it has affected those efforts, though, has honestly been the practices and the process that the NLRB has also had to amend and conform to, along with many different work sites, right, where much of it is more remote, right, much of it is less so. Business hours, right, have been shortened, right, or the capacity, right, for doing on-site work, like I mentioned before, on-site elections has been diminished, right? So in our most recent election, right, this was an interesting case where both the union, ourselves, and the employer, right, were okay with and agreed to an in-person election. But because of practices, right, and because of current capacity, and again, the rural location of the hospital that we were supporting, we didn't have that opportunity, right? Those folks didn't have the opportunity to have that in-person election, which would have been faster. So, yeah. Now that's the sector that I organize in. How it's affected other workplaces, yeah, it's having an impact, right? But yeah, not necessarily when it comes down to the election process.
Great, thanks for that, Josh. Another question from the audience. Could you speak to the importance of union density?
You want me to take this, Josh, or do you have?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so I can just sort of say that what we know is that as I went through, there are all of those related effects of states with high union density having, higher overall median incomes, overall better, you could argue, quality of life with greater insurance, coverage. But I think also we know that where there are industries where there's some measurable union density left, wages continue to be higher. Those continue to be better jobs, more predictable schedules, access to paid sick time, all of the benefits that come with winning a union. We know there's a spillover effect to an entire industry where you do have representation. And frankly, it's part of the reason where public sector jobs continue to be family sustaining jobs in many states because of the higher level of unionization. So union density is critical, I'd argue, for the overall health of a state economy and also those quality of life measures. But in a real way, it impacts the wages of a given sector. So I hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Celine. And there's an interesting question in here. Without the PRO Act, how can the NLRB ensure the rights to unionize for misclassified workers like gig workers, which is an important question considering that the Uber, Lyft, DoorDash ballot question was thrown off the Massachusetts ballot today, so it seems particularly timely.
Sure. Well, I mean, this is one of those areas where the Trump General Counsel had an influence. Peter Robb did a memo that clearly said that in his view, Uber drivers were independent contractors. They were entrepreneurs running their own independent businesses and were not covered by the NLRA. That is the purview of the General Counsel to issue a memo allowing people to understand his or her thinking on an issue. The current General Counsel has asked for cases where workers are believed to be misclassified and is going to reevaluate those positions. So I think it demonstrates that there is a fair amount of power in the agency still in how they interpret the act. If General Counsel Abruzzo views Uber drivers differently, and I would hope that she would, that was a deeply flawed memo in my view. Then those workers would arguably have their rights enforced. Again, the General Counsel decides which kinds of cases to bring and what the appropriate remedies to seek are. So if you have a General Counsel who is looking at let's say gig workers and really analyzing if under the NLRA they are appropriately classified as independent contractors, or are they being misclassified and are instead employees entitled to the rights and protections under the NLRA, then arguably she could seek to have them covered and take their case. And if there was an unfair labor practice charge filed by a gig worker, she could decide to apply the NLRA protections to that worker. So again, here's one of those areas where statutory change obviously makes things much clearer, but the agency does have authority in this area and how they these officials view and interpret and apply the act.
Thanks for that, Celine. The next question I have actually, this is one that's going to be coming from me. You talked about the funding levels for the NLRB. So what are some of the other practical implications of low funding levels at the NLRB on cases?
So I can just sort of say that I think from my perspective, what Josh has highlighted a number of times in his responses here is this issue of timing, and that in an organizing campaign and certainly in reaching an election, timing matters a great deal to the momentum that's building. And we're all, I think, paying more and more attention to all of the Starbucks cases that have been filed, the number of Amazon petitions that have been filed, and in reality, if you don't give the proper funding, resource the agency properly, then there will be a delay, even under the best of intentions of the field staff to process the election petitions, to investigate unfair labor practice charges and hold employers accountable. The fewer people that you have there doing that work, the more time it's going to take, and that is, I think, going to be frustrating to some of those organizing efforts. Obviously, Josh knows, the front line of that better than I, but I think the timing will be one of the most immediate impacts as the demands on the agency increase, and that should be encouraging to all of us that there's a greater demand in the agency. More workers, younger workers are filing, petitions for elections, but unfortunately, I think that they're going to face delays in processing if it's not adequately funded.
Thanks, Josh. Did you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I don't think so. I think that covered it.
All right, we'll hop to the next question then, and that's given the delays and lack of funding and the NLRB, do the panelists think it would potentially be more effective for workers to seek voluntary recognition first, or does this require too much good faith on the part of management to be an option for most workers organizing? I know how I'd answer that, but I'm going to turn it on.
Yeah, well, I think the reality is, given the current, rules that we're organizing under, right, is, voluntary recognition, right, has been I think, a plan, right, that has been put on the table, right, where in the past, right, where we had a quicker elections, right, it wasn't considered, right, because it's not the better of the options, right, but given the current system, right, there have been, I think, examples right here in Oregon, but really also across the country, right, of workers being successful, right, demanding voluntary recognition. I think it depends greatly on the work site and the makeup of that work site, right? Because, right, like I think is also alluded to in this question, right, it does rely quite a bit on the response, right, from management, right? And what we've seen in those systems, right, or those workplaces, right, where, density is being built, like Celine was mentioning earlier, where it's most critical, right, in some of the larger hospitals, right, or clinic systems, right, where you're talking about thousands of workers, right, across work sites, across departments, right, that are trying to organize not just one workplace of 20 people, but, 1,200 workers, right, across a medical center campus. Demanding or seeking voluntary recognition, right, first, it's harder to do. It's harder to win that way than it would be to have faster elections and quicker rules and just the assurance from the board, right, that workers can form their union by winning their election, right, through a fair process. So it's on the table currently, right, but I don't think it's the solution long term.
Great, thanks, Josh. And seeing that it's 4:52, we want to try and give folks a little bit of their time back. So I think we're going to go ahead and wrap things up for today. I first want to say thanks to our panelists, Senator Bob Casey, Celine Nicholas, and Joshua Springer for the great conversation. Apologies if you can hear my daughters losing their minds upstairs, but that happens. And I want to thank all of you for joining us. We really appreciate your commitment to workers' rights, and we look forward to working with you all in the future on all of these critical issues. Thanks again.